My name is Mark Simmons. I'm the Director of Policy at the British Ports Association. I'm going to be standing on this stage on my own for a little while, which whilst I thought I got used to hybrid working, it's a bit strange that the next three people joining me will be joining us from across the ocean in the Americas. I'll be moderating the event. As I said, I'm from the British Ports Association. We're a trade association representing a bunch of ports all across the UK. And I'm going to do my best to speak for as short a time as possible so we can hear as much from the impressive speakers we've got. The first session is climate change challenges and adaptation experiences from the Americas. And I'm delighted that we have three very impressive speakers from Maryland, the Port of San Diego, and Bahía Blanca in Argentina. And I'm sure the technology is going to work seamlessly. I'm going to sit down and we're going to hear from our first guest speaker. This is Jill Lemke, the Manager and Strategic Planning and Special Projects at Maryland Port Administration in the US. She's going to talk to us about extreme wind precipitation and riverine and tidal flooding for 15 minutes or so. And whilst Jill is speaking, please do, everyone online and here in Glasgow, get thinking about questions for Jill and the following speakers. But Harvey, have we got Jill? Is she there and ready to go? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, from the Port of Baltimore. It is truly an honor to be with you today, virtually, if not in person. As you just heard, I'm the Manager of Strategic Planning and Special Projects for the Port of Baltimore in Maryland. And one of those special projects that I work on fairly regularly these days is climate change and climate resilience planning. I'm here to share with you the story of our port and the Maryland Port Administration's climate resilience efforts. But first, a little background to help set the stage. After sharing a basic outline of our strategy, I will show you some of the project examples that implement our climate resilience strategy. Baltimore has a long and sustained maritime history. The Port of Baltimore was founded in 1706, predating the founding of Baltimore itself by 91 years. The city literally grew up around us. The port has a unique geography within the Chesapeake Bay, which is the third largest estuary in the world. The Maryland Port Administration, along with its federal partners, maintains a 50-foot navigation channel system for ships to access the port from the south and a 35-foot channel system to access the port from the north. The port has a strategic advantage as an inland port with overnight access to over 1/3 of the population of the United States and is the closest U.S. East Coast port to the additional markets of the U.S. Midwest. I work for the Maryland Port Administration, the public sector arm of the Port of Baltimore. Our mission is simple: to increase the flow of waterborne commerce through the state of Maryland for the economic benefit of its citizens. When I speak about the Port of Baltimore, I am referring to the entire port, which is made up of 45 miles of industrial shoreline that encompasses 6 publicly owned marine terminals and 23 private terminals and other marine facilities as shown on the map. Keeping the port working effectively requires partnerships between the public and private sectors on a local, regional, national, and international scale. 30 years ago, the port made a strategic decision to increase the diversity of the types of cargo handled at the port. This decision helped make the Port of Baltimore more diverse and more resilient to the ups and downs of the global economy and the business cycles, including the recent turmoil caused by COVID-19. In addition to cruise, the port handles containers, bulk cargoes, including sugar, coal, gypsum, salt, and break bulk cargoes led by forest products. Roll-on, roll-off cargo is one of our large cargo areas. That includes autos, light trucks, agricultural and mining equipment, and we also have a dedicated container terminal. In terms of climate risks, marine terminals by their very nature and location along the water's edge have always been subject to extreme weather and variable conditions. Climate change simply magnifies those impacts and the changes that we face. Because of our geography, the state of Maryland is one of the US states most vulnerable to the impacts of sea level rise. At the intersection of a coastal and riverine environment, the Port of Baltimore is focused primarily on flooding issues currently because we face the potential of sea level rise, adding to the impact of future storm surges on top of increasingly frequent and increasingly severe rain events. We are also studying and planning around the potential for increased sedimentation in the port's approximately 140 miles of dredged navigation channels. Also of concern are the impacts of extreme temperatures on both personnel and infrastructure, and the impacts of high winds, extreme snow, ice, and hail events are also a concern. At the MPA, we began exploring these issues in earnest after Hurricane Isabel hit Baltimore and the Chesapeake Bay in 2003, bringing with it 7.5 feet of storm surges at our terminal and 8.5-foot storm surges in downtown Baltimore, where our offices at the World Trade Center are located. We learned a lot of lessons from that event, including the impacts of flooding on our marine terminals and on the transportation networks leading to and from the port. We continue to work with our transportation partners on the risks to and the resilience of our transportation networks that is necessary to keep supply chains moving before, during, and after disruptive events. As a result of lessons learned from Hurricane Isabel, the Maryland Port Administration commissioned a climate vulnerability assessment in 2010 to identify climate risks and vulnerabilities to all of our facilities. To begin addressing some of these risks, in 2015, we formulated and adopted a three-pronged approach to capital project planning and design. When beginning to plan for all capital investments, we ask ourselves, can this function or facility be migrated or moved away from the water's edge and out of areas of high risk to flooding? Generally speaking, as a marine terminal function and as a port, the answer to this question is generally no. Then we move on to elevate. Can the facility, building, or structure be elevated in a way that minimizes the risk of flooding? In some cases, the answer may be yes. For example, we recently completed a new maintenance and storage facility that was elevated 2 feet above the 100-year flood elevation. And its emergency power generators were also elevated to protect it from damage and to keep the facility operating even in the event of flooding and loss of power from the grid. In other cases, the answer to the question of can we elevate may be no. For example, raising a small portion of a large marine terminal may interfere with the flow of cargo or potentially cause unintended flooding in other areas. So then we move on to mitigation. Mitigate is something we consider for every project, asking ourselves, can the project be mitigated with design and/or materials to reinforce or strengthen the facility, building, or structure to prevent or minimize potential damage from the impacts of extreme events when they occur? To improve the implementation of this strategy, we are currently working on illustrating the three-tiered approach in a decision tree, one that can be used as an implementation guide for project planners, designers, and engineers. It asks a series of questions about the project, potential climate risks, and the feasibility of migrating, elevating, and/or mitigating the project or its various components. I realize this is impossible for most of you to read, so I will happily share this with anyone who is interested. An example of how we are implementing this strategy is pictured here. This image shows the construction of an extensive stormwater vault and sand filter system as part of a project that filled a former wet basin at one of our automobile terminals. The finished product pictured here is a new elevated cargo storage area that has been leased and is currently in use at our Fairfield Marine Terminal. Another big resilience project, which is currently in the design and engineering phases, is the Dundalk Marine Terminal Climate Resilience Project that, once completed, will protect billions of dollars in valuable cargo from potential flooding from sea level rise, extreme rain, and storm surge. The map on the left shows in orange and red the areas of the terminal that would be inundated with flooding if a storm surge similar to Hurricane Isabel were to occur on top of 2 feet of sea level rise. Our engineers developed the resilience project as a solution after first studying the option of beginning to elevate portions of the terminal. Subsequently, it was concluded that elevating a nearly 600-acre terminal is not a feasible alternative. The Dundalk Resilient Project proposes a combination of temporary and permanent 32-inch sea curbs along the edge of the terminal berths with raised bollards and openings for vessel tie-ups and ro-ro ramps. Temporary barriers will be installed in these openings when a major storm is heading our way. The project will also construct a new storm drain culvert with backflow preventers in all of the storm drains and new stormwater pumps to remove water from the 570-acre terminal. This is a photo of another stormwater vault while it was under construction and is now successfully capturing and storing and treating stormwater runoff from a large section of paved cargo storage area on the Dundalk Marine Terminal. It has successfully prevented flooding during recent extreme rain events. In addition to hard infrastructure, we are also working on a variety of nature-based solutions for stormwater management, including wetland restoration, shoreline preservation projects. Pictured here is one of our off-site stormwater mitigation projects, which restored and strengthened a previously eroded shoreline for a local environmental education center. As part of the project, the students from the center can be seen here helping to plant native grasses that will help absorb storm surge and prevent further shoreline erosion. We are currently exploring additional such partnerships and pilot projects to utilize dredge sediments from our navigation channel in these types of shoreline restoration projects throughout the Baltimore Harbor and the areas of the Chesapeake Bay. In addition, we are exploring other possibilities to increase our climate resilience and adaptation efforts. We have prioritized investments by need, level of risk, and potential impact. We are investigating electric microgrid improvements, power redundancies, and emergency power generation options to help maintain terminal operations and terminal security before, during, and after emergency events. We are exploring new ways of using dredge material for resilience projects, such as terminal raising, wetland restoration, shoreline and island restoration, and using the dredge material will extend the capacity of our dredge material containment facilities, which is very important for us, given the fact that we do dredge over 140 miles of federal channel. We are identifying potential resilience partnerships with our federal, state, and local partners, including a valuable information sharing partnership that we have engaged with through the Baltimore-Rotterdam Sister Cities program, which has brought together people from both sides of the Atlantic Ocean to discuss similarities in what we're facing in terms of sea level rise and climate resilience. All of this is happening while we are strengthening our efforts and commitment to reduce greenhouse gases and other air emissions, thereby trying to do our part to help meet the greenhouse gas reduction goals of state, local, and international partners. And more importantly, to try to avoid and prevent the worst case scenarios of sea level rise and climate change in the state of Maryland and throughout the globe. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to time for questions and discussion after the other panelists' presentations.
Thank you, Jill. That was fascinating. And as Jill said, please get your questions ready. They'll be after we've had all the speakers. Our next presentation is from Philip Gibbons, who is the Program Manager for Energy and Sustainability at the Port of San Diego in the United States. He's going to talk to us for another 15 minutes about sea level rise and storm surges. Over to you, Philip.
All right, well, thank you and good morning. My name is Phil Gibbons. I do have a title change, actually. I'm a Program Manager of Climate and Resiliency now here at the Port of San Diego. The Port of San Diego, sorry, I'm just trying to change the slide here. It's slow on my side. The Port of San Diego is located in the southwestern portion of the United States, right down there in the corner, just north of the US-Mexican border. We manage the public tidelands and submerged lands of San Diego Bay. So a pretty broad swath of land around San Diego Bay that covers 5 cities around the bay, including the city of San Diego, the city of National City, the city of Chula Vista, Imperial Beach, and also the city of Coronado. We have a pretty broad administrative and business portfolio at the Port of San Diego. So we're not just a typical seaport. We manage a variety of properties and businesses, including visitor serving facilities such as restaurants, hotels, marinas. We administer over 22 parks and public promenades and walkways around San Diego Bay. We do have typical seaport operations. We have 2 cargo terminals that specialize in break bulk products, refrigerated containers, dry bulk products, as well as import of automobiles into the United States. We do have shipbuilding and boat repair facilities around the bay. And we have a pretty hefty environmental stewardship office at the Port of San Diego that administers natural resources within the bay. So we do a lot in our jurisdiction around San Diego Bay. We've been went one slide too far. We've been focused on climate change at the Port of San Diego for the past 10 years. We adopted a climate action plan over a decade ago, or around a decade ago. We were one of the first ports to commit to targets for lowering our greenhouse gas emissions. Just last month, actually, in October, our Board of Port Commissioners adopted a new maritime clean air strategy, which is focusing on a transition to zero emission operations at our port, which includes a transition to zero emission drayage trucks and cargo handling equipment, et cetera. Our goal is to clean up the air for our local communities that are adjacent to the port. But we're also focused on the impacts of climate change, most particularly sea level rise. And as Jill said, as a port, as a maritime institution, there's no place to go. You know, we can't really move that far back from the water's edge. We're located in a very urban and constrained environment, so we don't have far to go. Of course, we're focused on sea level rise because of those physical risks, the damage that storm surge may cause and inundation may cause, but also the transition risks. Transition risk being a changing regulatory environment here in California, or a changing social environment here in California. There's much more expectation that as we do new projects, as we do new developments, that we're planning for sea level rise in mind. So we conducted a vulnerability assessment for sea level rise impacts in 2019. This was pursuant to California state legislation, Assembly Bill 691, which requires grantees or trustees of public lands, which we are, to assess the impacts of climate change and begin planning for it. So this involved looking at different projections of sea level rise for different time horizons throughout this century, for 2030, 2050, and 2100. We were required to estimate the financial impacts that may have on our jurisdiction, describe how we plan to adapt to sea level rise, and of course, collaborate with stakeholders to do this work. So I just wanted to showcase the different projections of sea level rise that we utilized in our report. We used a near-term 0.25 meters of sea level rise by 2030, half a meter by 2050. And then, of course, as we get to the end of the century, there's a lot of uncertainty about what the exact number of sea level rise will be. So we chose a low end and a higher end, 0.75 meters at the low end, and then a 1.5 meter scenario at the high end. And each of these projections were coupled with a 100-year storm event as well to showcase what those impacts may have from temporary flooding that a significant storm may cause. Now, I will say in California, we utilize the best available science to obtain these projections. There are even higher estimates of sea level rise, but we worked with a stakeholder group that suggested these were the appropriate projections that we start out with. Now, I won't go through all of the different projections of sea level rise in each map, but I wanted to show you the high end scenario of sea level rise, the 1.5 meter sea level rise coupled with a 100-year storm event. This is San Diego Bay that you see in front of you. Our jurisdiction, we'll call it, is outlined in the orange line. The dark purple showcases the projected sea level rise inundation that would be caused by a higher level of sea level rise in the bay. And then the light purple showcases what temporary flooding may cause given a storm event in the bay. And just visually, as you look at that, you could see much of the area that we manage would be somehow impacted with water, with flooding or inundation. Given our analysis, what we learned in San Diego Bay, that there seems to be a tipping point when you get above about a meter of sea level rise in San Diego Bay. We start to see significant problems of permanent inundation and disruption that would be caused with flooding. Just for example, about 50% of the roads in our jurisdiction would be inundated. Another 50% of the building stock that exists within our jurisdiction would be underwater. 70% of our marine terminal acreage or parks would also be flooded. 90% of our piers that stick out into the bay may be underwater as well. Now, we like to say that this is tomorrow's flood on today's landscape. And so our goal is to use this as a cautionary tale of what we don't want to see. And so we've now started the process of planning so that this doesn't become our future. Now, I am a planner and strategist at the Port of San Diego. I'm not an engineer, so I don't build anything, but I do build reports and I build processes. So, and if a process can be built as a circle, I think all the better, because that allows you to fail and try again. And if there's one thing that we know about sea level rise is that we're going to know a lot more in the future. So we think that an adaptive management framework is the way to go to deal with sea level rise. This includes conducting vulnerability assessments like we've already done here at the port, and we'll do that again. Building our adaptation capacity. So experimenting with new solutions around the bay that I'll talk about shortly for adaptation, elevating, and those types of things. Monitoring sea level changes in San Diego Bay. We do have a historic tide gauge in the bay that's over 100 years old. So we have a pretty good record of water levels in the bay. And we're working with a lot of the institutions here the academic institutions here in San Diego to better monitor the bay and create forecasting models. And then that leads to strategy implementation. Any new project that comes before us, we're going to be designing with sea level rise in mind. And then over time, we can continually reassess how we're doing to be better prepared for the future. Now, I wanted to share some of the examples of how we're focusing on sea level rise and resiliency in San Diego Bay. We do believe that there are many options that need to be afforded to us. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution to dealing with sea level rise. Nature-based solutions, as Jill spoke about in her presentation, are very popular in California right now. Nearly about 70 to 80% of our shoreline is armored in some way around San Diego Bay right now. And we recognize that there may be ways to soften the shoreline in specific areas. And so we're trying to do that through these nature-based solutions. I wanted to share at least a couple of examples of this. We do have a blue economy incubator at the Port of San Diego, where we invest in new and emerging ocean-centric industries. One of the companies that we've partnered with on this is eConcrete. They're an Israeli company. And what they've done is created these interlocking tide pool structures that we can put into the revetment along the bay. And the purpose of these structures is to enhance the habitat value of the shoreline, as well as improve the structural integrity and at least safeguard the structural integrity of the shoreline at the same time. So we installed these structures earlier this year in 2021, and you can see that they're designed in a way that mimics a tide pool type environment. We're about to do a bunch of monitoring that will last for the next couple of years, but some of our initial assessment showcases that we are able to recruit biology and even species in these tide pool structures because of the pooling of water and the different texturization of the structures themselves. And if you look real closely, you probably won't be able to see this unless you have a big screen. There's a little octopus that's in that little circle there. You might be able to see its eye sticking out at you. So we're just happy to see these things functioning in a unique way. Another project that we're focused on in San Diego Bay and about to deploy is a living shoreline, similar to what Jill spoke about earlier. So this will act as somewhat of an armored solution in a more natural way, located down in the southern part of our bay in a more natural environment. And the purpose of it is to reduce the wave impacts and erosion that we're seeing along the shoreline. We just finished casting these structures that we'll put out into the bay. So we casted about over 350 of these structures that will be placed in the bay in these clusters. They were a unique mixture of concrete as well as oyster shell. And because of that, that texture again of the surface, it's meant to recruit native oysters in San Diego Bay. The three pictures that you see on the right side of the screen and the bottom is an example of another location. But in the end, after we deploy these, we expect them to look similarly, where they will gain in size as more and more oysters are recruited to them, and they'll act sort of as a breakwater out in the bay. So that's an exciting project for us that we received a lot of funding for the state as well as philanthropic institutions. We are also focused on typical solutions that you may see in large scale development or in a maritime environment. We completed a new fender project at our cruise ship terminal in San Diego Bay a couple of years ago. And the connections for the piles were designed in a way that they could be replaced in the future for higher sea levels. And then we have a very large scale development that is occurring down in the southern part of our bay on the Chula Vista Bayfront. Is one of the largest waterfront projects in the state of California right now. And this is just a rendering of what that area, or at least a portion of that area, is going to look like. But it's being designed with sea level rise in mind through elevation techniques. All the roads and the foundations of the buildings and facilities are going to be placed on higher grounds. The revetment's going to be elevated as well. It's also designed with habitat buffers that will allow the absorption of water and actually have the habitat be able to migrate upslope in the future. This is my last slide. I just want to share some of the lessons learned that we've experienced through our resiliency efforts over the past few years. First and foremost, stakeholder engagement and building partnerships is absolutely important. As we conducted our vulnerability assessment, we worked with a sea level rise working group that included tenants at the port, some of our local stakeholders, environmental groups, academia, scientists from both state and federal organizations that helped us learn about the science and actually make decisions on how to do that vulnerability assessment. That's really important. Secondly, I think a whole of government approach is necessary. This means that it's not just people like me in our planning department that need to be thinking about climate change and resiliency. This involves everybody in the organization, really, all the other departments, from engineering to policy to even finance. We need to, if we're going to take on this challenge, we need to battle it together rather than in our separate silos. As I said earlier, multiple solutions will be needed, not just nature-based solutions, not just armored solutions, but anything that we can think of. Again, there's really not a one-size-fits-all solution here. I do think that ports, at least our port, on how we're built, is well suited and well poised to deal with sea level rise. You know, the concept of public-private partnerships is a popular term here in the United States. That's inherent to what we do at the Port of San Diego. We work with tenants, private developers, private organizations all the time to invest in our waterfront. And I think utilizing that model is going to be important for investing for sea level rise and climate change into the future. But it also may require a paradigm shift for others. There's new financial models and different business models that are being developed that we need to take advantage of. The last thing I would say is, you know, and perhaps this crowd has moved on from being scared by uncertainty, but, you know, uncertainty is an area that has caused us in the past to hold off from doing the planning that was necessary to deal with sea level rise. And if any of you are in that space where the uncertainty is causing you to stall, don't let it. You know, you got to move on. One of my favorite people that I work with at the United States Navy here in San Diego once told me, hey, at some point you just have to pick a number and get to work as far as a projection of sea level rise. And I always remind myself of that when I get stuck on how to explain the science to people and how to move forward, that you just got to keep moving forward and don't let uncertainty slow you down. Well, that ends my presentation, and thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Philip. That was brilliant as well. I've got a bunch of questions for both of you, but before we come to that, we have Gerardo Bessone, who is the manager of dredging and navigational aids at the management consortium of the port of Bahía Blanca in Argentina, who's going to talk to us about the impact of low flow and drought on his port. So Gerardo, over to you.
Good afternoon to you all. Yes, I'll be presenting the consequences of extreme low water events on the ports in Argentina. Although in the last years, extreme flooding has been the main events, this past couple of years, 2020 and 2021, have brought to us unforeseen low waters for the last decades. First of all, let me see if I can, there it is. First of all, I'd like to present the Paraguay Parana waterway itself. The waterway has a total length of more than 3,400 kilometers in the Parana and Paraguay rivers, serving ports from 5 different countries, that is Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, Argentina, and Uruguay. There are 3 main sections: the ocean-going stretch, with a navigable depth up to 34 feet. This goes from the Atlantic Ocean up to the Timbúes, which is located on the north of the city of Rosario, and is a stretch of some 800 kilometers. From there on, up to Santa Fe, there's another stretch of navigable waters with up to 25 feet of draft. And northbound up to Corumbá, there's the stretch of mainly depth are reduced to 10 feet, and this section is for inland barges convoy, which differ in configuration according to the characteristics of the river at each section. If we turn to the waterway, also receives traffic from other main waterways within South America. One of them is the Paraná in Brazil, the Uruguay Waterway, which runs from the Salto Dam until the River Plate and is shared by Argentina and Uruguay. So the waterway becomes important not only to the Argentine economy, but also to that of Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. The last two countries mentioned are landlocked, so having this waterway is the sole connection to the sea. Some more numbers. Well, the total hinterland that the waterway has is over 3.5 million square kilometers, including some of the main agricultural areas in South America. It constitutes the main export route of Argentina, totaling almost 80% of the foreign trade volume and 60% of the value. In 2019, almost 2,600 overseas bulk carriers transported over 70 million tons of Argentina's agri-bulk and bio-based production, and another 16 million tons that came all the way from Paraguay and Bolivia. Another main feature is that the downstream traffic is 4 times greater than the upstream, amounting up to 500 vessels per month, including the seagoing vessels. So, as mentioned earlier, we will consider the consequences of the extreme low waters event solely from the perspective of its impact on navigation and trade, leaving aside the severe effects that it brought on other economic activities and also on the social tissue. Let me see. Yes. The Paraná River discharge is mainly the result of the runoff from the High Paraná Basin and the flow contributed by 2 main rivers, which is the Paraguay and Iguazu. There are statistics of mean discharges in the mid-Paraná section dating back to the end of the 19th century, which show a significant rise in the mean value from the 1970s onward. When we analyze the level at the Rosario area, this is done because that's the main production area where all the terminals are located. The period ranging from 1884 to 2020 show a mean water level of around 1 meter, whereas if we see just the period from 1884 to 1970, it is just 50 centimeters. And when analyzing the last period, the last 50 years from 1970 onwards, this value has risen to 1.87 meters. The rise in this mean value is attributed to, first of all, a humid period, and secondly, to the regulation of many hydroelectric power plants located upriver, mainly that of Itaipu and, in a minor scale, Yacyretá. This can regulate high waters, but in severe droughts, their capacity to improving low waters is transitory. The situation in 2021 presented the levels in Rosario reaching sub-zero values. This is the first time in decades that this occurred. I will not enter too much in the consideration of the El Nino. Perhaps most of you know it is an effect is well, it has to do with a recurrent climate pattern that implies that water temperature changes in the central and eastern tropical Pacific, where it brings the climate change on a global scale. This cycle has 3 phases: the neutral, the hot, known as El Nino, and the cold phase, known as La Nina. Well, 2020 and 2021 has seen the cold phase, or La Nina, which is characterized by strong western trade winds, which generate greater contrast between the cold eastern Pacific superficial water and that of the western Pacific warmer ones. This produces droughts in South America and heavier rainfall in the western Pacific. Here is a graph made by the Argentine Water Institute that shows the evolution of the levels at Rosario the past year, and a comparison. The line in blue is what's happening now, and the line gray is what happened on the worst recorded year, which is that in 1944. This was done in order to monitor and compare the events. The Argentine Institute has worked 3 possible scenarios, being the best case that the levels don't drop even further, and but this will depend mainly on what happens in the upcoming summer month. So we now I will present to you the Argentine port system. Well, Argentina is a very large country. It's the 8th country in the world, and there are 101 registered commercial ports, which range from in the north from Puerto Iguazú to Ushuaia. The total distance between these 2 ports is more than 4,500 kilometers. As you can see in the picture, in the map, most of the ports are located along the Paraguay-Parana waterway. The rest is located on the Atlantic coast. This responds to the location, responds to the main product areas in the country. Most of the export, are done using Panamax bulk carriers. That's even in normal conditions in the upriver ports have limited to 34 feet. So it is required to top off elsewhere. This is done mainly in 2 of Argentina's Atlantic ports. One is Quequén and the other one is Bahía Blanca, where both ports have an operational draft of around 45 feet. What's not done in these ports, depending on where the destination is, sometimes they go directly to Brazil, to the port of Paranaguá and Santos. The obvious consequences of low level is the loss of cargo capability in the ships, incrementing the top off elsewhere. Depending on the destination and the type of vessel is the impact on the total volume transported. In the case of handy-sized, it is most likely to leave the port upriver directly to its destination, that mainly is Brazil, without topping in any other port. This is the case mainly of barley and wheat, whereas when we refer to Panamax-sized vessels, as is the case of mainly soybean, corn, etc., they have to top off elsewhere. If we look at the loss of cargo because of the low water, around the month of August this year, it had reached more than 9,000 tons per ship. A good example of this cargo shift that occurs is corn. As you can see in the map in the left-hand side, the darker shaded areas show the main production zones where the percentage of the land destined to grow corn is higher. Clearly, the closest ports to these areas are located along the waterway, making the ports in the Atlantic, the area destined for corn fairly small. This is reflected when you look at the numbers of the exported values. Back in 2017, on a normal year, 83% of the total volume of corn that amounted more than 20 million tons were exported through the upriver ports, whereas just over 10% was done in Bahía Blanca with 2.5 million tons. If you look at the historic top-off values in Bahía Blanca for Panamax, it is about 21,000 tons per ship. You got the graph here on the right-hand side shows the weekly values, and during some weeks in August and September, this value reached well over 31,000. And if you look at the total volume of export in the Atlantic port, especially in Bahía Blanca, in just 9 months, the export volume has reached 5.4 million tons, whereas that's already more than the whole of the already record-breaking 2020. The counterpart of this is what happens on the ports upriver, where you can see that the graph here, the orange line shows the level, and the blue bars, the amount of the mean amount of cargo per month. And that shows that during August presented the values well below the normal, and at the same time that we were getting record volumes in the Atlantic ports. So this shows clearly that the cargo has shifted south, in part to allow to cope with this current situation with the levels. So the question that arises is at what cost and what were the consequences? Distances in Argentina are great because, the distances between the major cities and ports could be counted in hundreds of kilometers. With such a large geography, the logical choice would be transporting a great amount of cargo with the railroad system. But reality shows, at least today, that most of the cargo is transported using trucks. If you see the map on the left, this shows the flow of the trucks, where the thickest line show the places where the flow is greater. There's clearly a concentration towards the upriver ports and in a lesser value to the Atlantic. If we look at the numbers, in recent years, 2 million trucks arrived at Rosario every year, with peaks of over 14,000 trucks a year. And in Bahía Blanca, this is about 400,000 trucks per year, with peaks of 4,000 trucks per day. Also, if you look at the rail, well, although most of the terminals upriver have rail connections, the total amount of cargo received by train in 2020 amounted to just 15% of the total load. And in Bahía Blanca, although being one of the ports with the highest percentage, that is 30%, of the cargo was received by rail. Even so, it has the problem of the outdated and in need of revamping infrastructure. Another problem is that this intense traffic occurs on roads that generally aren't in the best of states. Most of these roads count on public funding, provincial or national, for maintenance and repairs. Near the ports, located in the vicinity of urban areas, it's not rare to find long queues of trucks waiting on the road to unload on the terminals, provoking, first of all, great congestion and disrupting the rest of the traffic, but also sometimes the consequences is an increase in accidents. This mentioned cargo shift is seen also in the numbers of trucks received at each port. In the period of March to July this year, Rosario area saw numbers drop by 20%, whilst at the same time, Bahía Blanca saw there increase by 46%. We were talking about also the costs. Well, on a normal year, there is a spread between the prices the exporters have to pay for this case, corn in upriver against the value in the Atlantic port. This is because the availability of the product and transportation costs are different. During 2021, values fluctuated from 8 to 12 to 18 US dollars per ton at the beginning of the year. But as levels continued to drop, this spread grew, reaching an all-time high value of $38 per ton in 2012. The Serial Stock Exchange of Rosario has carried out an evaluation on the total economic losses, mainly due to these higher prices, that this low water crisis have brought up, and up to now, the value is estimated is around $350 million. But this, when the emergency passes, this volume, some say, could well double. But also, beside this higher cost, it is undetermined how much cargo has been lost to Brazilian ports, which is directly a loss to the Argentine economy. So I'll quickly go to the conclusion because my time is up. One can summarize that even without the unanimous consensus as to what the extent of the relationship between climate change and extreme events related to El Niño, it is undeniable that in the past couple of decades have seen frequent high water events, and particularly since 2020, we are experiencing low waters unforeseen for more than 70 years. Also, the Paraguay and Parana waterway has become vital for the Argentine economy, enabling to lower costs on commodities, production, and transportation. So any disruption in this traffic in this waterway has consequences that, even though it can be partly compensated, shifting part of this cargo to the Atlantic ports. And well, with a deficient intermodal transport system, with already some problems as it is, this extra stress on the road transportation as the main means to cope with the cargo shift brings higher costs, and also not only on the economic side, but also on the environment. Obviously, this type of event must be taken as a awakening call to improve transportation and infrastructure in general in order to cope with them in a more sustainable way. Well, thank you very much. This has been my presentation.
Thank you, Gerardo. That was fascinating. I hadn't appreciated the scale of Argentina. Right, we're going to take we've got a bit of time, about 20 minutes or so, for questions from the audience here and online. I'm going to walk around to stop the lights turning off on me again, unless that was someone here. So, Harvey, are the questions online? Are they visible somewhere? Or does anyone in the audience here in Glasgow have a question? First of all, we've got a mic coming to you, this gentleman here. Please remember to introduce yourself and where you're from.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Thanks very much for the presentations. I'm Malcolm Moore. I'm chair of Greenwich Infrastructure in Scotland, but also one of the maritime advisors to UK government. And my interest, I think, stems from the challenges we've got. So here we've had some really good presentations on climate, but we also have other issues, cyber attacks on ports. We've clearly got a pandemic and other challenges. How does this fit into the scheme of things? Where do they see this as a priority in the ports that we've mentioned?
Thank you. And should we take one more question? Well, if we give the panel a bit of time to think about that one, where does this fit into other resilience challenges? Richard?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Richard Ballantyne from the British Ports Association. Great presentations and fascinating oversights from around the world. A lot of synergies and similarities with the experiences that UK ports are looking at and dealing with. My question to the panel is, we've talked, or a lot of your presentations are about the measures taken to safeguard against things like sea level rise, storm surges, other extreme weather events. I just wondered if they wanted to flesh out a little bit more about some of the green things they're doing to demonstrate that their ports and their part of the sector is doing its bit to help challenge the issues associated with climate change that we're discussing or that's being discussed at COP26 this week. Thank you, Richard.
I'm going to, as I can't see my panel, either on the screen or in person. I'm going to pick on them in the order they spoke to tackle one or both of those questions. So, Jill, I hope you heard those questions. Do you want to go first? Have a stab at taking those?
Sure. The first question having to do with other priorities, including cybersecurity, the pandemic, and other issues that face ports and are facing the global economy, are things that we also take very seriously at the Port of Baltimore. We have recently added cybersecurity to our resilient strategy. And mainly that has to do with our focus on microgrids and emergency power sources so that we can maintain the security and information technology structures that are operating the port. Obviously, as we move forward into the future, as digitization and the Internet of Things becomes more commonplace on port terminals, that is going to be an increasing issue, and we are starting to pay closer attention to that. Our security department at the Maryland Port Administration has applied for and received millions of dollars worth of grants to help address some of the cybersecurity and security in general issues with regards to digitization and overall terminal security. With regard to the green things that we're also doing, we do a lot. We have a very big focus on doing our part as environmental stewards for our local environment and the Chesapeake Bay. We work in partnership with other state agencies. We have a very robust partnership with other state agencies regarding air quality and air emissions, and we work very closely with them and our local communities. And we do have a robust community engagement and community education program that helps bring in the communities around the port and help them understand what it is we do, and we try to understand what it is that they're most concerned about. We have a robust program to replace engines, both dray truck engines and cargo handling equipment engines and marine terminal engines in the port, replacing them with more energy efficient and lower emission engines, things like that. So those are just a few of the examples of things that we do at the Port of Baltimore.
Thanks, Jill. Millions of dollars of grants for cybersecurity. Someone write that down. We could do some of that. Philip, do you want to answer any of those questions?
Sure. Yeah, I can address some of those. We've suffered from cyber attacks at the Port of San Diego in the past 5 years that halted our operations for a portion of time. So we have experience in that. We also didn't fare so well over the past year or so because of the pandemic. As a waterfront area that does have quite a few restaurants, hotels, visitor serving facilities, those were largely, not being utilized by the public for the past, 18 months or so. So our revenues did fall quite significantly over this period. So we definitely have a robust IT department that is trying to thwart off cyber attacks, probably every minute of the day, it seems like. So we built up our capacities to do that. We are hopefully coming around when it comes to the pandemic ending. We're seeing a lot more people coming out and staying in hotels and visiting restaurants, and a lot more commerce flowing through the waterfront area, which is great news for our revenue projections. Our maritime sector actually did well during the pandemic, so that was good news. Sea level rise is, an existential threat to our port. It's something that as we all discussed, we're starting to prepare for now. Interestingly, in San Diego, there's not a lot of great examples of flooding that occurs right now, however. which is good. I mean, we have a fairly resilient waterfront by today's standards. That'll change into the future, but there's not this collective recognition or memory of, the days when the Embarcadero was completely flooded. So a lot of people don't really have a good understanding in our region of the potential impacts that sea level rise may cause. So it's partially my job and others' jobs to kind of tell the story of how we need to prepare so that we don't see these major disruptions into the future. As far as the green initiatives, gosh, a lot of the same things that Jill spoke about as well. We've been actively working with our tenants and operators on our maritime industries to demonstrate new technologies such as electric drayage trucks, Class 8 semi trucks that come and move cargo from our port. Many of our tenants have had an opportunity to deploy those and utilize those in their operations. Same thing with cargo handling equipment. We're about to procure 2 new electric gantry cranes at our port, so that's exciting. We've been using shore power for at least a decade now in some of our maritime industries, and are expanding shore power use almost across most of our ocean-going vessels. Should be capable of shore power over the next 10 years, and we're putting in the infrastructure to do that now. I could probably go on, but I'll pass it on to Gerardo.
Thanks, Philip, and good to hear good pandemic news. Gerardo, over to you. Do you have any thoughts on interdependencies between different vulnerabilities?
Well, I'm going to speak mainly of the port I work for, not the whole Argentine port system. We are a bit lagging on digitalization of the operation, but we've started to do so, and obviously security, cyber security is already being taken into account as we start to walk this path to digitalization of operation. On the side of what happened with the COVID, or what is still happening, we fared pretty well. Although most of the port activities were reduced because manpower present was reduced, this didn't affect the normal operation. And what's more, thanks to what I've been saying about the low waters in elsewhere, we saw a number of volume increase during the pandemic. The volume of cargo handled. So we on the theme of green port, last year we completed the first survey of carbon footing and on the port and on the area surrounding the port, because we are located at one of the main petrochemical hubs in the region. So we started measuring in order to know our baseline, particularly to know where we stand and what we can do to reduce emissions. The port itself hasn't yet adopted any measure, but we are surely looking into it because, it's a must for everybody.
Thanks, Gerardo. And whilst I figure out how to find the questions that have been asked online, you all talked about the importance of working with stakeholders and interdependencies. Jill had a really a photo of the road connected to the port that was flooded. How have you found those discussions? Are stakeholders, are governments, road authorities, and tenants? Are they listening? And has that been changing in recent years? And what sort of luck are you having convincing them to design more expensive infrastructure from the beginning? And how is that changing? And I'm going to start with Philip this time.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, and it's interesting. We actually started climate adaptation planning at the same time that we were developing our climate mitigation plan. So this is circa 2010, 2011. And at that time, focusing on climate change, even though that doesn't sound like a long time ago, it was a different world back then. And adaptation was really confusing to people. And there was, thoughts that if we started to showcase flooding across our jurisdiction, that nobody would want to come and invest into our port anymore. By the time we decided to hold off on doing our adaptation planning back then and focusing on the mitigation side first. And then in 2019, as I spoke about in my presentation, we actually completed our sea level rise vulnerability assessment. We have definitely seen a shift in attitudes and more people interested, curious, and fearful of the impacts of climate change over that period. And I would say even over the past couple of years, since we completed that vulnerability assessment, we've even seen more and more people ready to take on the challenge of sea level rise. So new developments, et cetera, that are coming to the port will be designing with sea level rise in mind. So we're certainly seeing more of that from the development community before us. But I would say there's still a lot more capacity building that needs to occur. As I answered before, along our bayfront, there just isn't this collective recognition that flooding can occur. We don't have these pictures that showcase roadways flooded out, and we certainly don't want to have that happen to make people more aware. But sometimes that's what it takes for people to understand what sea level rise and storm flooding may cause. So there's much more awareness now, much more ability to act and starting to spend money in this arena. But I think that there's more that's going to be needed.
Thanks, Philip. Gerardo, over to you. I'm guessing there's an added level of complexity if you've got 5 different countries to speak to about the river there.
Well, I will mainly refer to my port, which is the subject I know best. It is very difficult sometimes to align the necessity of the port with that of the rest of the stakeholders, especially when coming to when you got restrained budgets, which is the case for us. So what we've been doing is we've been contacting from the port with the national and provincial authorities in order to work together to try to improve road connection and also most of the rail system is private, so we've contacted also the private owners of the railroads in order to get together and try to improve at least the connection between the arrival to the port. Unfortunately, the rest is really out of our reach. I mean, what happens in those many hundreds of kilometers from one place to the other is totally out of our scope. But what we are also trying with the terminal, with the serial terminals, is to improve their capacity to unload, and it is also to establish some kind of quota system in order to prevent this great queues that form, because we received in a very short period of time many trucks. But as I said, it is everything is quite difficult, and but we are addressing the problem because we don't have any other means of keep on expanding if we not resolve at least partially the problems we're having today.
Thank you. And Jill, how are you getting on in Maryland with your stakeholders and other interdependencies?
Yes, Maryland may be a unique case because we are currently subject to the impacts of climate change. We have had historic towns destroyed by a rainstorm that dropped 6 inches of rain in a matter of an hour and a half. And that happened again 2 years later in the very same town. We've had coastal flooding. We have seen sunny day flooding from extreme high tides. So Maryland is unique. Maryland has been focused on climate change for, I don't want to say decades, but over 10 years for sure. The Maryland Climate Change Commission, which has been set up on a statewide level, brings people together from all walks of life to talk about climate change. They have 5 working groups. I serve on the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Work Group for that Maryland Climate Change Commission. So we are plugged into what's happening in other areas of the state, and we are able to help guide state policy on a broad scale. The state of Maryland has also instituted a Maryland Climate Leadership Academy, which I participated in the very first class. It is an educational program to offer climate leadership training to any state employee or resident of the state who is interested in these issues. And the reason behind this effort and the state investment in education on climate change is because climate change is affecting everyone, whether or not we realize it or not. And it's going to take an army of people who understand these issues from a variety of perspectives to deal with what is coming and prepare, and to make sure that state government is set up to support the private sector and our communities in dealing with the future of climate change, and to try to, like I said, prevent the worst case scenarios of climate change. So that is an effort that has been going on to raise awareness and to raise the amount of intellectual capital that is being applied to the solutions surrounding climate change. So from a private sector perspective, it's also coming to us from our customers. Several customers have reached out to us as a port, not me specifically, but to find out what we're doing in terms of climate change and how we can help them meet their own climate emissions reduction goals through supply chain management. So I think it's a growing interest and a growing concern from a variety of levels. In the past 5 years, I would say we have seen a dramatic increase in the number of questions that we get from elected officials asking us, what are we doing to prepare for climate change? So it's a growing issue here. Like I said, we are already facing the impacts of climate change. So we may be somewhat ahead of the curve, but it is a process.
Thanks, Jill. That's it's really interesting. And I think, as someone said earlier, the pandemic in particular may be causing more people to focus on resilience issues of all types. Well, I've got one question online, and then I'll briefly come back to the room before everyone gets a well-deserved coffee break. This one's from Phil Buckley. Is there a suggestion that enhanced climate effects such as El Nino and the jet stream in the Atlantic may make East or West Coast ports more or less viable in 2050 and beyond? UK experience might be that West Coast ports that tend to be deeper, have natural features, may have more climate change resilience. This is getting controversial, Phil, than East Coast ports that may be more lower lying and therefore more prone to extreme climate, sea level and weather effects, or at least some of them. Gerardo, I'm going to come to you first. Are some ports going to be less oh, it's on the screen, fine. Are some ports going to be less viable in 2050? I know you already talked about the impact on cargo flows at your port.
Yes.
What do you think?
As I said, it's not been established per se, the climate change and El Nino effect for certain, but what we've been seeing is this high waters, mainly high waters in the waterway, which also disrupt the traffic, because what happens is, the problem is what happens after the high waters, with very much increased sedimentation along the waterway and the disruption to H2 navigation, which then really costs a lot of money to maintain. On the side of the Atlantic ports, at least to our knowledge, there hasn't been much difference with water levels, water rises up to now, at least here in Bahía Blanca, where we have records going back more than 100 years. But that doesn't mean that extreme events, if they should occur, wouldn't rely on taking some measures. We, as I said, well, Bahía Blanca is located at the end of a very long estuary, so all of the events in the Atlantic sort of get attenuated, and we're not facing directly what happens in the Atlantic. I know other ports in the area have had problems with extreme surges, which have have presented problem on infrastructure and so forth. So it is most likely that there will be some affection, especially on those ports which are directly on the Atlantic coast.
Thanks, Gerardo. Jill, I think you talked about looking at the economic impacts of resilience as well. Is your port considered how climate change may affect your competitiveness against other ports?
We look at everything we do through the lens of our competitiveness. If there wasn't a business case for climate resilience, we wouldn't be pursuing it. But we are a landlord port. We lease our terminals to terminal operators and shipping companies who actually handle the cargo. We don't actually move the cargo, but we are responsible for helping to protect that cargo, and not addressing climate change would be seen negatively from a competitive perspective, because nobody wants their cargo to be damaged by flooding or high winds. So we are doing everything we can to make sure that our competitiveness rises to the challenge, that we rise to the challenge and maintain our competitiveness. We look at it in terms of sustainability. We want the port to be a sustainable economic engine for the state of Maryland for decades to come. We have been around, like I said, for over 300 years. And we want to be around for another 300 years. So we are following the science. I don't know. I have not seen any science or any projections about how potential changes in the Atlantic tides and not tides, what am I trying to say? The currents along the coast might impact our competitiveness. Like I said, we are an inland port. We are inside the Chesapeake Bay. We are tidal, so any changes in the Atlantic Ocean could impact us, but we have not seen science that would suggest that that issue is one that could negatively impact us. That doesn't mean that it might not in the future, but we are keeping an eye on science.
Thank you, Jill. And finally, Philip, any thoughts on that and how it might affect your competitiveness?
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything more to add to that discussion other than, as part of our charter as a manager of these public lands around San Diego Bay is the importance of maritime commerce. So that is one of the main reasons we are these public stewards of the land. So it's our job to make sure that the waterfront is prepared for any type of hazard, especially the hazards that we've talked about today. So our role is to institute and build up the infrastructure to make us a competitive port. So that's what we'll continue to do. We haven't done any type of analysis though that looks at if there decreased resilience, let's say on East Coast ports that would move products through our port because of that. We haven't done that type of work.
Brilliant, thank you. So a few eyes on the coffee urns here. So we're going to wrap it up and have a very short break. If you could, those online, please take 10 minutes. We'll be back in 10 minutes for the next session. We're hearing from harbour masters and pilots. But if everyone here could please thank our speakers. I'm not sure if they'll be able to hear it, but with a round of applause. Thank you.